A heart surgeon's life is a life of control. It is about steady hands, cold logic, and the absolute power to fix what is broken. Dr. Hasnat Khan was a master of his craft, a man who held human hearts in his hands every single day. But in 1995, he was confronted with the most famous, most broken heart in the world, the heart of Diana, Princess of Wales. She would call him Mr. Wonderful, the true love of her life. She believed he was her cure. But this is the story of a tragic and impossible diagnosis. A story of a surgeon who fell in love with his patient only to realize that her disease, her suffocating, all-consuming, incendiary fame, was incurable. This is not the story of the princess who died in Paris. This is the untold story of the man who tried to save her, the only one who saw the real woman inside, and the agonizing choice he had to make when he realized that in order to save himself, he had to let her go. The image of the shy, blushing bride of 1981 should be erased. The woman who walked into the Royal Brompton Hospital in the late summer of 1995 was not that girl. She was a completely different person, a Diana. 2.0 forged and hardened by a decade of private heartbreak and public warfare. She was 34 years old, officially separated from the Prince of Wales, and navigating the final volatile and deeply painful stages of an explosive divorce. This was the woman who had just months earlier secretly conspired to bring a television crew into Kensington Palace to record the Panorama interview. That act was not just an interview. It was a declaration of war, a precisely aimed cannonball fired directly at the hull of the House of Windsor, in which she had uttered the immortal, devastating line that confirmed her husband's betrayal. There were 3 of us in this marriage. The fallout from that interview was seismic. She had won in the court of public opinion. She had established herself permanently as the Queen of Hearts, the wronged woman, the victim who would not be silenced. But she had also, in that single act, made herself a pariah within the institution that still technically controlled her life. She was, in 1995, the most famous, most hunted, most photographed, and most powerful celebrity on the planet. And she was also, by her own account, one of the loneliest. Her life was a paradox of staggering proportions. She was a global humanitarian force capable of changing landmine policy with a single photo op. And she was a woman living in a state of profound and not entirely unjustified paranoia. A woman who had her room swept for bugs, who believed her car was being tampered with, who saw the gray, faceless men in suits of even the firm as an active, hostile force working against her. She was isolated. Her royal protections, the very buffer that had once shielded her, were being systematically stripped away as her divorce progressed. Her HRH title, her Royal Highness, was on the negotiating table, a symbol of the battle for her very identity. She was a woman who had every material thing, palaces, jewels, couture, access, and yet by all accounts had no normal life. She was a princess desperate to be a person. And she was, more than anything, looking for a protector, for a man who was not part of the establishment, a man who had his own power, a power that had nothing to do with titles or land. She was looking for someone who saw her, the woman, not the tiara. And then, on a humid September afternoon, she walked into the one place where royalty, in its true, vulnerable human form, must eventually go, a hospital. The other side of this story is not a palace. It is not a place of protocol, of history, or of inherited privilege. It is the Royal Brompton Hospital in Chelsea, a world-class center for heart and lung disease. And its world, in 1995, was the world of the British National Health Service. It was a world of 36-hour shifts, of life and death decisions made at 3 a.m., of pagers and beepers, of lukewarm coffee and polystyrene cups, and of a relentless grinding pressure that had nothing to do with headlines. This was a world of pure, unadulterated meritocracy. You were not judged by your name, your family, or your accent. You were judged by one thing and one thing only: your skill, your ability to hold a human heart in your hand and fix it. It was in this world that Dr. Hasnat Khan lived and breathed. He was not a prince. He was not an aristocrat. He was not a playboy. He was a 36-year-old Pakistani surgeon, a registrar, a man on the long, difficult, and exhausting ladder of a medical career. He was, in the hospital hierarchy, a kind of prince, but his title was earned, not given. His background was, in its own way, just as proud as hers, but entirely different. Born in Jhelum, Pakistan, he came from a respected, highly educated, and deeply traditional Pashtun family. His royalty was one of intellect and professionalism. His grandfather had been a landowner. His family tree was filled with academics, engineers, and military officers. It was a world where success was not measured in column inches or invitations, but in degrees, in publications, and in public service. He had followed this path of service from Pakistan to Australia, and finally to London, the global epicenter of his chosen, fiendishly difficult specialty, cardiothoracic surgery. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant doctor, a natural surgeon, a man with golden hands. But he was also, to his very core, a profoundly private man. He was serious. He was focused. He was married, as his family would often complain, to his work. His life was a closed loop: hospital, study, sleep, repeat. He had no time for television, no interest in celebrities. He lived in a small, notoriously messy one-bedroom flat in Chelsea, a flat that was less a home and more a recharging station, just a few streets away from the hospital. He was a man who, in every conceivable way, was the absolute antithesis of her life, and that is exactly what she was searching for. Their meeting on September 1st, 1995, has become a legend, a meet-cute so perfect it feels like a Hollywood script. Diana was at the Royal Brompton visiting a friend, Una Toffolo, whose husband, Joseph, was recovering from a major triple bypass operation. Diana, as she so often did, had connected with this woman, a healer, in a moment of shared vulnerability. Una's husband had been near death, and Diana had been a source of comfort, making regular, unannounced visits to the hospital, often late at night, long after the press had gone home. She would sit with Una, talking for hours. On this particular day, Joseph was recovering in the high dependency unit. The man who had performed the complex, life-saving operation, the man who was checking on his patient, was Dr. Hasnat Khan. By all accounts, he was tired, rumpled from a long shift, his mind entirely on his patient's case file. He was walking down the corridor when Una Toffolo stepped out, wanting to thank him yet again. And with her, standing there in the sterile fluorescent light of a hospital hallway, was the Princess of Wales. Diana, as she often did, was connecting with the other patients, offering comfort. Her friend Una saw the doctor in the corridor and introduced him to the princess. By all accounts, the connection was immediate, electric, and profound. Khan, a serious man focused on his work, was suddenly face to face with the most famous woman in the world, who was looking at him not with the deference of a royal, but with an open, unfiltered, and deeply human interest. He would later testify in a rare statement that his first impression was that she was very down to earth. She shook his hand. He, polite but professional, excused himself to continue his rounds. As he walked away, Diana turned to her friend. "Una," she said, her voice full of a new sudden energy, Isn't he drop-dead gorgeous? It was a spark. For the next few weeks, Diana found with surprising regularity that she needed to be at the hospital. She would time her visits, sitting with Joseph Toffolo, waiting patiently for the doctor's rounds. She was, as her friends would later note, like a schoolgirl with a crush. She would watch him from a distance, watching this serious, focused man, this Mr. Wonderful, as she would soon call him, who held the power of life and death in his hands, and who seemed, most intoxicatingly of all, to have no idea who she really was, and to not care one bit. She was the one who got his number. She was the one who, after weeks of careful, strategic visits, finally called his beeper, a gesture that, in 1995, was both shockingly direct and utterly terrifying. Hasnat Khan, a man who saved hearts for a living, was suddenly in danger of losing his own. He was understandably terrified. He knew who she was. He knew what dating her would mean. It was, as he later said, a choice between his career and his sanity. But her pursuit was relentless, and his fascination with her, this complex, beautiful, and deeply wounded woman, was just as strong. And so began, for the next 2 years, one of the most secret, most profound, and most normal love affairs of the 20th century. And in Diana's mind, such a wonderful man, such a real man, was not just a diversion. He was a destination. Those stolen moments in jazz clubs and the quiet nights ironing his shirts weren't just an escape from her life. She was actively road testing them as a blueprint for a new one. What began as a secret, a thrilling affair was now about to deepen into something far more serious and far more dangerous, a plan for the future. This was not a casual affair. For Princess Diana, this was the end game. This was, in her mind, the man she was going to marry. This was the man she believed would be the father to her children. After a lifetime of being a public symbol, of being a wife in a dynastic arrangement, she had, at 36, finally found a connection that felt real, authentic, and most importantly, private. She was, in her heart, already planning the rest of her life with him. She wasn't just in love with a man, she was in love with the life he represented, a life of purpose, of service, of intellect, and of a blessed, beautiful normalcy that she craved more than any diamond. In her inner circle, this was no secret. Her butler and confidant, Paul Burrell, would later recount a moment of such vulnerability and hope that it is, in retrospect, almost unbearable. One day Diana came to him, giddy with an excitement he had not seen in years, holding a small silver-framed photograph. It was of Hasnat Khan's father. Burrell later said she even put it beside the photos of William and Harry. When Burrell looked confused, she explained, her eyes full of dreams. She wanted to wake up every morning, she said, and see the grandfather of my future daughters. Think about that. This was not a woman having a fling. This was a woman who was already, in her heart, populating a new family. She, a woman who had famously produced The Heir and the Spare for the House of Windsor, was now dreaming of a quiet life with a Pakistani heart surgeon and a house full of dark-haired, brown-eyed daughters. She even made discreet inquiries with a priest about whether an interfaith, largely private marriage could ever be possible. She was not just daydreaming, she was, in her own way, logistically planning. She was a woman who had broken every rule in the royal family, and she was preparing to break the final, most significant ones. She was, it seems, willing to give up everything for him. She began to actively surround herself with people who could bridge the gap between her world and his. She leaned heavily on her friend, Jemima Khan, the British heiress who had done the very thing Diana was dreaming of. She had married a famous and respected Pakistani man, the cricketer Imran Khan, and had moved to Lahore, converting to Islam and embracing the culture. Diana, it is said, peppered Jemima with questions. What was it really like? Could she do it? Could she live there? What were the rules? What was the family structure? She was studying, preparing, trying to fit the vast, complex shape of her life into the small, traditional, and sacred box of his. And in 1996, her fantasy took a very real, very public, and very dangerous step. She decided she had to meet his family. This was an operation planned with all the secrecy and logistical precision of a military campaign, but it was at its heart an act of pure, desperate love. In May 1996, Diana flew to Pakistan. The public reason, the cover story, was a brilliant one. She was traveling as a high-profile supporter alongside her friend Jemima to help raise funds for the Shaukat Khanum Memorial Cancer Hospital, a state-of-the-art facility being built in Lahore by Imran Khan in memory of his mother. It was the perfect cover. It was humanitarian. It was selfless. It was, in every way, a Diana mission. But the real reason for the trip, the hidden, far more high-stakes agenda, was to arrange a private visit to meet members of Dr. Khan's family, hoping to show them she could fit into his world. This was not a state visit. It was an audition. The Princess of Wales was, in effect, going to Pakistan to ask for her boyfriend's hand. This was not Princess Diana who arrived at the Khan family home. She left the tiara, the Versace gowns, and the entire armor of her Western celebrity at home. She arrived wearing a traditional Pakistani shalwar kameez, a beautiful, modest, and deeply respectful outfit. This was not a costume. It was a statement. It was a gesture of profound respect, a signal that she was not there to overwhelm them with her royalty, but to submit to their culture. She was, for the first time, not the most important person in the room. The Khan family was, understandably, in a state of quiet panic. They were a respectable, educated, and deeply conservative, traditional middle-class family. And the Princess of Wales, the most famous, most scandalous, and most non-Muslim woman in the world, was sitting in their living room on their sofa, drinking their tea. They were, by all accounts, charming, polite, and completely, utterly terrified. Their son, their brilliant, serious Hasnat, was their pride and joy. And he had brought this whirlwind, he was this global phenomenon, to their door. Diana, a woman who possessed a charisma that could disarm world leaders, turned the full force of her charm on them. She was, as always, brilliant with the children, playing with Hasnat's young nephews. But she was particularly and strategically focused on Hasnat's mother, Nahid. Diana knew, perhaps from her own difficult relationship with her mother-in-law, the Queen, that in a traditional family, the mother's approval was everything. She sat with Nahid. She spoke of her love for Hasnat, of her respect for his work, of her own humanitarian efforts. She was trying desperately to bridge the vast, unbridgeable chasm between their two worlds, to show them that she was not the caricature in the papers, but a woman, a mother, a person who could make their son happy. The meeting, by all accounts, was polite. It was warm. But it was not the triumph Diana had hoped for. The Khans were, as one friend put it, charmed, but horrified. How could this possibly work? How could their son, a man who cherished his privacy, a man whose entire life was dedicated to the grueling, anonymous work of saving lives, ever be a partner to a woman who was literally hunted by packs of photographers? How could he bring this global circus into their quiet, respectable family? His mother's reported reaction, delivered later to her son, was simple, loving, and devastating. He is marrying his work. He will not marry you. It was the loving, protective wall of a mother who saw with perfect clarity that her son's happiness and this woman's life were fundamentally incompatible. But Diana, a woman who had fought the British monarchy and won, was not so easily deterred. She returned to London, not defeated but more convinced than ever that this was the life she wanted. She reportedly told her friends, "I've found my peace. I know what I'm going to do." In her mind, the Pakistan visit, while not a total success, was the first step. She believed she could make it work. She believed love could make it work. But as she was planning their future, Hasnat Khan was beginning to feel the walls of his present close in. The emotional impact on him was the exact opposite of hers. Her love was a tidal wave, and he was, quite simply, drowning. He loved her. Of that there is no doubt. He would later testify that he found her to be a very normal and deeply caring person. He was in love with Diana, the warm, funny shirt-ironing woman who read his textbooks and watched Casualty with him. But he was terrified and increasingly suffocated by Princess Diana, the global institution. And that institution was beginning to close in. The secrecy, which had at first been a kind of romantic, thrilling game, was becoming a strain. It was a lie, and Hasnat Khan was not a man who was built for lies. He was a man of science, of facts, of directness, and he was living the life of a fugitive. He couldn't go out. He couldn't be seen. He couldn't have a normal dinner with the woman he loved. Their entire relationship was lived in the shadows, in the back of cars, in the dark corners of jazz clubs, or locked inside one of their two homes. He was, in effect, a prisoner of her fame. And this, for him, was not just a social inconvenience. It was a professional and existential threat. He was a surgeon. His work required absolute focus, a steady hand, and a clear, uncluttered mind. How could he perform a 6-hour bypass operation when he hadn't slept because his girlfriend had been smuggled into his flat? How could he focus on a patient's collapsing artery when his mind was worried about a photographer parked on the street? This is the central, unresolvable conflict of their entire relationship. It is the tragic, perfect paradox. She wanted to join his world of normalcy, but her very presence, the radioactive glow of her fame, destroyed that normalcy, not just for him, but for everyone he touched. Her fame was a Midas touch in reverse. Everything she touched, everyone she loved, was instantly turned from a normal person into a public cartoon. He saw with a surgeon's cold clarity that this could not last. He was a man from a conservative Muslim family, a man who deeply respected his parents. He knew their fears. He was already living a life that was, in many ways, a betrayal of their values. He was a 37-year-old man living in sin with the most famously un-Islamic woman on earth. The pressure from his family was immense. They were pleading with him to end it, to come home, to find a suitable wife. He was caught in an impossible tug of war. On one side was Diana, the woman he loved, a woman of intoxicating warmth, vulnerability, and glamour, who was offering him a life of, quite frankly, unimaginable privilege. On the other side was his family, his faith, his culture, and most importantly, his vocation, his life's work, the very core of his identity. He had to choose. And for a man like Hasnat Khan, the choice was, in the end, obvious. His work was not just what he did. It was who he was. Their relationship, by the spring of 1997, was under a level of strain that would have broken any normal couple. They were arguing. He was pulling away. She, sensing his retreat, was clinging tighter, pushing harder for the one thing she thought would solve everything: marriage. If they were married, she thought, it would be official. It would be real. The world would have to accept it. He, in turn, knew that marriage was the one thing that was absolutely, completely impossible. He saw it not as a solution, but as the final public execution of his life. The bubble had to burst. For 2 years, They had existed in a state of miraculous, suspended disbelief. They were the most famous secret in the world. And in June 1997, the world finally and fatally found them out. It was a front-page, world-exclusive story in the Sunday Mirror. Diana's secret dates with Dr. The secret was out. They had been found. For Princess Diana, this was a familiar, if deeply unpleasant, part of her existence. She had lived with this for her entire adult life. She was angry, not for herself, but for him. She knew with a sickening certainty what this would do to the man she loved. For Hasnat Khan, this was not an inconvenience. This was a nuclear bomb. His life as he knew it was over. His face was everywhere. A man who had only ever wanted to be known for his work was now overnight the most famous mystery man on the planet. The press descended. This was not the polite royal press pack that waited outside palaces. This was the tabloid wolf pack, and they were rabid. They camped outside the Royal Brompton Hospital, shoving cameras in the faces of nurses and patients, asking if they knew the love doctor. They followed him home to his small, nondescript flat, turning his quiet residential street into a 24-hour media circus. They offered his neighbors, his colleagues, his distant relatives, fortunes for any scrap of information. He was a man who, in his own words, began to feel like a patient in a hospital who was being observed by the world, and I couldn't breathe. He was a surgeon. His work required absolute focus, a steady hand, and a clear, uncluttered mind. How could he perform a 6-hour bypass operation when he hadn't slept, when he was being chased down the street by men in vans? How could he concentrate on a collapsing artery when his mind was worried about a photographer with a long-lens camera perched on a rooftop opposite his apartment? This, for him, was not just an invasion of privacy. It was a mortal threat to his identity, his integrity, and his life's work. And then the stories turned ugly. The press, in its racist, classist, and xenophobic way, began to dissect him. Who was this Pakistani doctor? Who was this foreigner? He was not a prince. He was not a suitable English aristocrat. The News of the World published a story quoting one of his own distant relatives, disgustingly, calling him a stud for the princess. For a man from a conservative, proud, and deeply traditional Pashtun family, this was not a joke. It was a profound, unbearable humiliation. It was a disgrace to his family name, a source of deep shame for his parents back in Jhelum, who were now being hounded by local reporters. The media wasn't just destroying his life, it was destroying his family's honor. This is where the story becomes a painful, complex argument. Why, just a few weeks later, in the suffocating heat of July 1997, did they break up? The how and why are still to this day debated. A painful he said, she said played out by their friends and biographers. It was the final agonizing conversation of an impossible situation. Argument 1, and the one supported by Hasnat Khan's own later testimony, is that he ended it. He was a man at his breaking point. He was, in a word, a man, a proud, professional, and traditional man, and the woman he loved through no fault of her own was stripping him of all three. He had become Mr. Diana, a footnote in her story. He was a man who was used to being in control, in the high-stakes theater of his operating room, and in his own life. And he had lost all control. He was a character in her soap opera. He reportedly met her in Hyde Park, a final secret meeting. He told her, with a surgeon's brutal honesty, what was happening. His life was, he said, a living hell. He explained that it wasn't just the press, it was her world, the entire machine. He told her that he could not and would not be this. He could not be a part of her world. He was a man from a conservative Muslim family, and the scandal had made his position untenable. The public shame was too great. He then, according to his own account, gave her the one final impossible solution. He told her that the only way their relationship could possibly work was if they moved permanently to Pakistan, not as a fantasy, but as a reality. Away from the British press, away from her life, where he could be a doctor and she could be just a wife. He knew as he said it that this was impossible for her. Her sons, the future King of England and his brother, were in England. She would never, could never leave them. It was in effect a gentle but firm goodbye. He was a man choosing his own identity, his family, and his life's work over a love that he knew, with a surgeon's cold clarity, would kill him. He was performing a kind of emotional amputation to save his own life. But there is another version of that story. Argument 2, the one told by Diana's closest friends, like her confidant, Lady Annabel Goldsmith, is the mirror image. This version claims that she was the one who ended it with a heavy, broken heart. He wouldn't commit. She was 36 years old, her divorce was finalized, and she was, for the first time in her adult life, free. But she was desperate for an anchor. She was desperate to formalize their relationship, to finally have a win, to prove to the world and to herself that she was worthy of a good, decent man's total commitment. She had given him an ultimatum. We must get married. We must make this public. And he, terrified by the media storm and the pressure from his family, had refused. He had, in her eyes, gone cold. He had faltered. He had chosen his family and his privacy over her. For Diana, a woman who had spent her entire life being let down by men, a father who had been distant, a husband who had been unfaithful, this was the ultimate, final betrayal. He was just like the rest. He didn't have the courage. He was, as she reportedly told her friends, letting me down. He was not Mr. Wonderful. He was just another man who couldn't handle her. And so frustrated, heartbroken, and furious, she called it off. The truth, most likely, is a tragic, messy combination of both. They had both reached the same conclusion from two different opposing directions. It was an impossible situation, a problem with no solution. He couldn't live in her world and she couldn't live in his. They had reached a dead end. And it is what Diana did next that defines the entire tragedy. It is the key. In mid-July 1997, just days after their final painful and agonizing separation, Diana, heartbroken and, according to her friends, utterly distraught, accepted an invitation. It was from the billionaire Egyptian businessman Mohammed Al-Fayed, the owner of Harrods. He invited her to join him and his family on their 200-foot, multi-million-pound super yacht, the Jonacol, in the south of France. This is the moment. This is the sliding door. This is the catastrophic decision that would lead, just 6 weeks later, to a tunnel in Paris. The Dodi Fayed relationship was not a new love. It was a reaction. It was a rebound of world-shattering, earth-scorching proportions. Her friends, like Rosa Monckton, who was on a holiday with her just before she left, were adamant. The entire high-profile and very, very public romance with Dodi Fayed was, in their view, a performance. It was a desperate and ultimately fatal attempt to make Hasnat Khan jealous. Let's look at the psychology, the heartbreaking, transparent psychology of a woman in pain. She had just been, in her view, rejected by a man who was private, dutiful, and poor, and whose family saw her as unsuitable. So what did she do? She immediately ran, not just to another man, but to the exact opposite of Hasnat Khan. Hasnat was a private, serious doctor. Dodi Fayed was a public, flashy film producer. Hasnat lived in a messy, one-bedroom flat. Dodi lived in a world of private jets and Parisian penthouses. Hasnat couldn't afford to take her to dinner. Dodi's father owned Harrods and the Ritz. Hasnat's family was terrified of her and the press. Dodi's father, Mohammed Al-Fayed, was desperate for her and actively encouraged the press. This was the key. Mohammed Al-Fayed was the anti-Khan. He was a father figure who, unlike Hasnat's, welcomed her with open arms. He wanted her. He saw her as the ultimate validation, the final royal stamp of approval on his own outsider family. He gave her the one thing Hasnat Khan's family could not, a public, enthusiastic embrace. He surrounded her with security, with luxury, with a no-problem world where anything she wanted she could have. For a woman who had just been told no, this intoxicating, all-encompassing yes must have felt like a drug. And so, the performance began. She was in Saint-Tropez on the deck of a yacht, surrounded by paparazzi, creating the very images that she knew Hasnat would hate. She wasn't hiding in a wig. She was in a leopard print swimsuit on a jet ski, posing. She was, in effect, holding a gun to Hasnat's head, screaming in a language of front-page photos. Look what I'm doing. Look at this new, wealthy, available man. Look at his father, who loves me. Look at this life I can have. Aren't you going to stop me? She thought the images of her with another man, the headlines of this new glittering romance, would finally force Hasnat's hand. She believed, according to her friends, that he would see these photos, realize what he was losing, and finally heroically ride to her rescue. It did the exact opposite. It confirmed his worst fears. For Hasnat, sitting in London, a city he could now barely walk in, and seeing the front page photos of the woman he loved kissing another man on a yacht, it was a validation of his decision. This was the circus. This was the life he had refused. He saw it not as a cry for help, but as a confirmation that she was, and always would be, part of a world he simply could not and would not enter. This was the final tragic and total miscommunication. She was speaking in the language of celebrity. He was listening in the language of a normal private man. The last time they spoke on the phone in late July, the distance was palpable. She was on the yacht, in her world of sun and glamour. He was in London, in his world of duty and stress. The connection was lost. A few weeks later, in mid-August, she called his home. He was out. She left a message with his family. It was just a few days before the fatal final trip to Paris. He never called back. The connection was, for the first time, truly and completely severed. And Diana, heartbroken, defiant, and perhaps still hoping he would change his mind, continued her public performance with Dodi Fayed. She flew from the south of France to Sardinia, and then for one last fateful stop to Paris. She was in a city of light, but trapped in a vortex of her own making, one that was spinning faster and faster, pulling her toward a dark tunnel by the river Seine. The crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel on August 31st, 1997, ended everything. It ended Diana's life. It ended Dodi Fayed's life. And in a different, quieter, but no less profound way, it ended the life that Dr. Hasnat Khan had known. He was at home in London when the first confusing news reports began to break. He was, according to his later testimony, woken by a phone call. The details were fragmentary, chaotic, an accident in Paris, serious injuries. He tried frantically to call her. He called her mobile phone, he called her at the Ritz, but the line was just, as he said, a strange noise. He could not get through. As the hours ticked by, the news grew darker. He did what he had always done. He went into his professional, dispassionate medical mindset. He thought as a surgeon about her injuries. He knew what a high-speed crash in a tunnel meant. He knew the mechanics of trauma. He knew, with a cold, creeping dread, what was happening. And then, in the early hours of the morning, the official announcement came. She was gone. Hasnat Khan's world, a world he had already tried to wall off, simply imploded. The woman he had loved, the woman whose shirts were perhaps still in his flat, the woman he had walked away from just weeks before, was dead. And he was, in that moment, thrown into a private hell of what-ifs. What if he hadn't broken up with her? What if he had called her back? What if she hadn't been in that car with that man in that city? It was a spiral of grief, guilt, and a shock so profound it was paralyzing. He attended her funeral in disguise. While the world watched the spectacle, the celebrities, the royalty, the heartbreaking image of her two young sons walking behind her coffin, Hasnat Khan was there, an anonymous ghost. He wore a dark suit and sunglasses, sitting far in the back of Westminster Abbey, a private, silent mourner, watching the world grieve for a woman he had known in a way none of them ever could. He was, in his own words, devastated. And in the days, months, and years that followed, the world went mad. A cottage industry of I Knew Diana books sprang up. Her butlers, her bodyguards, her astrologers, her personal trainers, her friends. Everyone, it seemed, was rushing to cash in. The market was flooded with tell-alls, with lurid private details. Her other, less significant lover, James Hewitt, wrote a book, betraying her trust. Her butler, Paul Burrell, whom she had called her rock, wrote a book revealing her most intimate secrets, including the details of her relationship with Khan himself. The world was awash in betrayal, except for one. Hasnat Khan remained silent. This is perhaps the most significant and the most defining chapter of his life. In the hysterical gold rush that followed Diana's death, Dr. Khan was the one person who held the most valuable currency. He was the Mr. Wonderful, the true love. He was the one man other than her husband who she had truly wanted to marry. He could have named his price. He was offered, by his own account, millions of pounds for a book, for a tell-all interview, for a single television special. He could have been rich beyond his wildest dreams. He could have set the record straight. He could have been a global celebrity, a household name. He did none of it. He refused every offer. He turned his back on the money, on the fame, and on the temptation to own his part of her story. He packed his bags, he returned to the hospital, he put on his surgical scrubs, and he went back to work. He continued, in his quiet, dignified, and almost holy way, to save human hearts. His silence in a world of such deafening, greedy noise was the most profound testament to the truth of their love. It was a roar. He was the one man who didn't betray her. He was the one man who proved that his love and his respect for her was never for sale. He had guarded her privacy in life, and he would, with an iron will, guard it in death. He had refused to be part of her circus, and he refused to be the ringmaster of her memory. His significance in her story, and in our understanding of it, is therefore immense. He is the great tragic what-if of her final years. He is the sliding doors moment. We are forced to ask the unanswerable, heartbreaking questions. What if the press had never found them? What if his family had been more accepting? What if he had been a different man, a man willing to compromise, to accept the gilded cage of a royal consort? And the biggest question, what if she had been with him? Several of her closest friends later said they believed that, had she still been with Dr. Khan, she would not have been in Paris that night. She would not have been in Paris. She would not have been in the chaotic, unprotected employ of the Fayeds. She would have been, in all likelihood, in London, perhaps sitting on his sofa, watching Casualty in a wig, and she would still be alive today. He was the cure she was looking for, but the disease of her fame, a fame that she both courted and despised, was too strong. He was the brilliant surgeon who could see the rot at the core of her life. Who could diagnose the illness, but who knew with a terrible, fatal certainty that he could not perform the operation? To save her, he would have had to destroy himself. His one rare public statement given years later, not for profit, but as a legal witness to the official inquest into her death, is the final heartbreaking word. He spoke not of scandal, but of love. He described her as a very normal person who did not play games. He described with a surgeon's simple clarity the love they had and the impossible, unsolvable problem they faced. And in that testimony, he confirmed the tragic central truth. When asked why their relationship ended, he spoke of the press, of his family, of his career. But he also spoke of her. He spoke of the Dodi Fayed relationship, the one that the world mistook for true love. He said with a quiet sadness, "I think she was trying to make me jealous." He knew. He had read her final desperate message, and it had arrived too late. The tragedy of Hasnat Khan is not that he lost the princess, it's that he couldn't save the woman. He was the one man who truly saw her, the normal person behind the icon, the woman who ironed his shirts and read his medical textbooks. And he loved that woman. But he, more than anyone, understood that she was inextricably chained to the princess, an institution of fame so powerful it destroyed everything it touched, including, in the end, her. His famous quote, given in a moment of pained reflection, was not one of bitterness, but of simple tragic fact. "If we had married," he said, "my life would have been hell." It is the heartbreaking admission of a man who knew that the only way to save himself, his sanity, and his life's work was to walk away from the woman he loved. In the years after her death, Dr. Hasnat Khan kept working quietly in cardiac surgery in the UK and abroad, helping to set up services and train younger doctors. He has in every sense fulfilled his calling. He is a man who continues to mend broken hearts, a quiet, profound, and dignified life of service. He has remained to his core the Mr. Wonderful Diana fell in love with, the man whose power came not from a crown but from his hands. He was the one man who asked for nothing, and the one man who, as a result, she wanted to give everything to. Theirs is the ultimate heartbreaking love story of the modern age. The very thing she loved about him, his normalcy, his duty, his complete lack of interest in her fame, was the very thing that made it impossible for them to be together. He was the one man she couldn't have, and the only one she truly wanted.